Welcome back, everybody, to the NCAA Next Up Dynasty here on NCAA Football 14. Season number 1 of the series is officially in the books. Last episode, we went over the college football playoff between South Alabama, Middle Tennessee State, Georgia, and Michigan. If you missed the last episode, I encourage you to check it out. I'll leave a card at the top right of your screen so you can watch it if you have not. Overall, I think the college football playoff was really exciting, and it was a really fun way to end our first season of the series. South Alabama scored a buzzer-beater touchdown to beat Michigan. Georgia squeaked away from Middle Tennessee State. The national championship wasn't as close, with Georgia steamrolling South Alabama 55-27. So Georgia, after losing the championship last year in this universe, they complete their unfinished business. They win the championship. And top quarterback prospect Clyde Williamson cements himself as the likely number 1 pick in this year's draft. Although he was good, but he wasn't really the star of the show for the Georgia offense. That was running back Patalomayo Madawalu, who scored 6 touchdowns against Middle Tennessee State, and he added 3 more against South Alabama, winning the college football playoff's most valuable player, unsurprisingly. So as we wrap up season number 1, today we're going to go through the offseason episode. I'll show you guys the All-Americans, the awards, which you guys voted on, and some of the stat leaders as I talk about what today's episode is going to look like. So we're going to go over everything that the offseason entails. We're going to talk about the coaching carousel, which coaches get fired, where do those coaches end up, and what all of the new jobs around the rest of the country are going to look like. The thing I'm personally most excited about is the players leaving stage. Obviously, we know the seniors who are going to be in this year's draft class. We've gone over a lot of them in the prospect profiles for our Tennessee Titans franchise. If you guys didn't know, all of the seniors in this series are going to be in the Titans franchise. However, we don't know the underclassmen who are declaring for the draft, so we will find out today all of the juniors and sophomores who are leaving school early and will enter the draft. We're going to talk about the juniors and sophomores leaving today in more of like what that means for college football rather than how they're going to do in the NFL. However, my next Titans franchise episode, which I'm probably going to upload tomorrow, we'll be doing a prospect profile on all of the underclassmen who are declaring for the draft, and we'll dive deeper into who they are as prospects and where I think they could possibly end up in the draft. Along with that, we'll quickly go over the transfer portal as well. We'll briefly touch on recruiting. And then we're also going to go over the custom conferences stage, which is going to be fun because I have multiple big-time movers across college football. Notre Dame, Oregon, amongst the many names who have been linked to new conferences. So we'll see what that entails. And I'm also going to go over the new college football playoff system. This year, we ran a 14 playoff, but that won't be the case next year. So you'll have to stay tuned later in the episode to see what that is going to look like. Because again, I have really big plans for that. So it should be a fun offseason as we prepare for season number 2. I won't be previewing any of the teams and whatnot today. That's going to be in the season preview episode, which will be the next episode of the series. That episode probably won't be out for like a week and a half or so. The reason being that I want to finish the Titans franchise offseason before we get to season 2 of this series. I want to try to have this series and the Titans franchise like linked together in time. I was able to end the Titans first season way earlier than I was for this series, which is why I haven't uploaded the Titans franchise in like a week and a half, because I needed to wrap up season 1 of this series just so I knew which players were entering the draft class so I could add them before we get to the offseason for the Titans franchise. So let's get this show on the road. We're going to start the coaching carousel, and the 2 biggest new job openings are LSU and South Carolina. Osiris Young and Jabari Achebe were both fired after leading their schools to under 500 records. So we'll see the new jobs there. LSU is hiring South Alabama head coach Everett Lemieux. So Lemieux makes a national championship with South Alabama, and now he's bolting for LSU. As for South Carolina, who will they be looking to hire this year? They ended up going with Edmund Setzer, the head coach at the University of Virginia. So Virginia is going to need a new coach as South Carolina poaches them. Virginia Tech, they're hiring Mr. Reliable himself, Michael Wilson, from the MAC champion Ohio Bobcats. Oklahoma State will be hiring head coach Ayo Ayuluko from Middle Tennessee State. So after leading them to a college football playoff berth, he'll be going to Oklahoma State. And yes, that means we will be using Oklahoma State this year, although I have everything set to auto, so it doesn't really matter who I user. Although I do think whoever you user gets a little boost in sim. So I'm kind of using Oklahoma State as my guinea pig for my little science experiment to see if you really do get a boost from usering a team. So that means Middle Tennessee State needs a new head coach. They are rocking with Anthony Mitchell, the head coach of Hawaii. So they poach him from Mountain West. Virginia is going with Ogobo Anecho from Tulane. Tulane had a great season. I think that's a really good hire. David Harris is going to Northwestern. Osiris Young, former South Carolina coach, is now the offensive coordinator at Georgia. Jabari Achebe is now the defensive coordinator at Navy. Quite the drop-off from being the head coach at LSU. Edmund Orient was fired from Ole Miss. He is going to Iowa State, so he will remain a head coach, unlike some of the other fired coaches. So that is what the coaching carousel for the first season looks like. A lot of the good coaches ended up getting extensions. I didn't really think it was worth our time to look at all of those. As we now get into the part of the episode that I'm most excited about, the players leaving stage. Which underclassmen will be entering the NFL draft early? It's not like real life where you know kind of who's going to declare. In this game, it's literally a crapshoot. I have no idea which underclassmen are going to be interested in entering the NFL draft this year. Here are all of the seniors, and again, we knew these guys were going to enter the draft. We've gone through a lot of these players throughout the prospect profiles in Season 1 of the Titans franchise on Madden 23. So none of this right here is a surprise. What we want to find out is the underclassmen declaring for the NFL draft. All right. Here we go. So in total, I think there were about 50 or 60 underclassmen who are declaring. I just want to point out now, don't worry about the round they're projected to go into. I don't care which round the game is putting them in. I just care about which players are here. For example, look at North Carolina wide receiver Rambo Lumpkins. He's projected to go in the 7th round, but he's 6'4", he's super athletic. He just caught 15 touchdowns and 1,100 yards this year. No way in hell would he be a 7th round pick in real life. He's probably going to end up as a 1st or 2nd round pick, and so I will put him as a 1st or 2nd rounder in the draft class for the Titans series. I don't know if any school took a bigger hit than Texas with the underclassmen leaving. They lost a lot of guys on offense, including their 2 main running backs, Amadeo Kalu and Asante Baker. They lost one of their starting receivers, Datchenko Dali. And in my opinion, the biggest surprise of any player who declared, Benedict Sparrow, their quarterback. Yes, the same Benedict Sparrow who threw 21 interceptions this season. I do think Benedict Sparrow projects pretty well as an NFL prospect. He's a big guy. He's got a strong arm. He's pretty mobile. But I think he really should have stayed another year in school because he wasn't very good this season. Texas's roster is loaded, and he wasn't very impressive. I mean, the 21 interceptions speak for themselves. The only other underclassman quarterback to declare for the draft with Sparrow is Genesis Moon out of Florida. Unlike Sparrow, I think Genesis Moon will be a pretty high pick in this year's draft. He's also pretty big, 6'4", 215 pounds. His numbers aren't insane, but I think he was really good this year, and I think he projects very well as an NFL prospect. He very well could be the 3rd quarterback off the board, maybe in the 1st round. So Florida's losing their quarterback, but they do have some good young starting QBs behind him. A lot of offensive playmakers declaring early, including Jaden Wilson-Miller, the wide receiver from Alabama, Benny Dixon, the starting running back for Kentucky, Jaden White, wide receiver Notre Dame. White and Wilson-Miller are kind of in the same mold because both of them were being used improperly in run-first offenses, so I'm kind of happy they both left school. Michael Starks and Xavier Rose among some of the other receivers declaring for the draft. We already talked about Rambo Lumpkins. He's going to be a 1st or 2nd round pick. Really, really talented player. And then Quintel Caslin declared for Vanderbilt. I think Vanderbilt's going to be pretty good next year, so that's a pretty big loss for the Commodores. And then as we scroll down, some of the other players in here. Notre Dame lost their 2 starting outside linebackers, Pierre Madison and Cooley Gandro. A few other defensive players of talent, Colton Neeson from Miami, Yannick Tybalt, the safety out of Ohio State. Kendall Zavitz is one of the youngest players in the class as a redshirt sophomore. Oklahoma lost their 2 starting offensive tackles. Ohio State was another big loser. They lost a lot of guys. They did retain their quarterback, Margot Brunley, who will be a senior this year. Alabama lost their number 4 corner, Nate Turner. So their 4 top corners from a season ago are all gone. And then even going down further, Tyreek Callahan from South Alabama. He had a scoop and score in the semifinal college football playoff game against Michigan. C.J. Thomas Jr., really, really good player for LSU. Another guy who's definitely not going to be a 7th-round pick. He's going to go way earlier. Penn State lost some interesting players in Raymond Foster Hest and Wellington St. Angelo. And that's it. A lot of interesting players thought about testing the waters, but decided to stay in school. Tykeem Rogers from Georgia, I think, could have been a top 5 pick had he declared. He's so big, so athletic, so talented. 2 quarterbacks tested the waters and decided to stay in school. 2 very different players on the opposite end of the spectrum. We start with Bartholomew Blount, who was a Heisman contender this year, led his team to the playoffs. I get why he'd be interested in the draft. I think he would have been a first-round pick. Michigan ends up holding on to him. The other one is Romeo Colucci, Oklahoma's backup. If you remember at the beginning of the year, Oklahoma had a QB battle with Colucci and senior Masaru Lee. Lee won the QB battle and ended up winning the Heisman Trophy, so obviously it worked out quite well for the Sooners. But Colucci was a backup this year. I don't know why he would be interested in the draft. Luckily for him, he isn't going to the NFL. He'll get to stay in school and potentially have a big junior season for Oklahoma. Some of the other notable players in here include wide receiver Hector Estrada III. With some of the really good young receivers in college football declaring this year, I think it's smart for some of these other receivers to stay in school. Elijah Bryant and Brody Kluge, in my opinion, would have been the top 2 running backs off the board, but they both decide to stay in school. I think Gilbert Smith could have been a first-round pick. Jaleel Joolholm, Devin Banks, all of those guys could have been really high picks, but they're going to stay in school another year. As for the transfer portal, quite a bit of activity here. I think the biggest loser has to be Alabama. They lost 2 5-star freshmen. A wide receiver, Griffin Weaver III, is going to TCU, and linebacker Kelvin Newberry is staying in the SEC, going to Tennessee. 2 major losses for the Crimson Tide. The number 1 player in last year's recruiting class, Kyon Clark, who went to LSU, is transferring to Navy. He is following his head coach, Jabari Achabe, who was fired at LSU and is now a defensive coordinator at Navy. Ryan Whippy, a running back out of Ohio State, is going to Florida International. And then 5-star running back Newton Burke out of Ole Miss is going to Iowa State. Here's another guy following his head coach. Edmund Orient was fired at Ole Miss. He was hired at Iowa State, and he's bringing his 5-star running back Newton Burke along with him. Stanford lost a couple players in conference. Wide receiver Jonathan Gonzalez, an 80 overall freshman, is going to Oregon State, and his good buddy Brad Mangum, a 4-star running back, will also be leaving Stanford for Oregon State. So a nice little haul there for the Oregon State Beavers as Stanford loses 2 good players. Mike Oxlawn, a tackle for Maryland, is transferring to UConn. J.D. McNamara, one of the top defensive linemen in last year's recruiting class, is going to Ball State. Jeffrey Reinstan is going to Kent State. He wants more playing time. That doesn't really make sense because he did not get a year of immediate eligibility, so he'll be able to play in Season 3, and he would be the starter at Maryland anyway, so I don't really get that decision. Kamani Smith Gardner is going to Troy. Dustin Wallace is going to Southern Miss, so if anything, he's going to a better program than FIU. The only player who thought about transferring but convinced to stay is Duke wide receiver David Odorat. So there you go. Those are all of the players who will be in new homes next year, whether that's through the transfer portal or going to the NFL. For the players who are going pro, this will be the last time we see them in this series, but again, have no fear. We'll be able to follow all of these players' careers throughout the Tennessee Titans franchise, some of whom are going to be drafted by our Titans, which should be fun, and then others are going to be on opponents around the league. So I'm very curious to see how a lot of these guys' careers all pan out, especially with some of these underclassmen, how it's going to shake up the top of the draft. All right, now we're in the recruiting portion of the offseason. I'm not going to talk about the top recruits specifically because a lot of them I'm going to be editing into subscriber-made players, which if you want a player, join the Discord server. Link is in the description. I'm going to go over the team classes, however, look at some of the recruiting rankings. As we take a look here, Oklahoma ended up with the number 1 recruiting class in the country. They had 3 5-stars. The only team with more is Michigan, who had 5, and then Clemson was the only team with multiple 5-stars with those 2. Ohio State had the most 4 stars. Tulane and NC State had the most overall prospects, with North Texas grabbing the least amount of players. And then looking at the top of the recruiting rankings, the top 25 specifically, Nebraska finishing in 4th is a little bit of a surprise. Other notable teams here include Pitt and LSU in the top 10. So, new head coach Everett Lemieux getting off to a hot start with the LSU Tigers. Missouri finished really high in 11th. A lot of SEC teams here. The national champion Georgia Bulldogs finished in 15th. Miami got the number 1 overall prospect in the country. They are in 16th. And then rounding out here, some surprising teams like Maryland, Navy, and Boston College. Looking at some of the schools who got 5 stars, UTEP got the number 1 quarterback in the country for the second time in 3 years. I wish I could say I was lying. Troy and Old Dominion also got 5-star prospects. Oklahoma State did as well. Don't tell anybody, but I may have helped them out a little bit. There was a low-lock 5-star who was interested in coming to Oklahoma State, so I put him on the board and gave him points. So it is worth noting that Troy, UTEP, and Old Dominion all had more 5-stars than Texas. Is Texas really back? Honestly, they probably are, because they had the 5th best recruiting class in the country, and they lost their interception-throwing quarterback. So maybe Texas really is back. Custom conferences is another thing I'm really excited about because there are some pretty big changes I made to the college football landscape. I know a lot of people have been suggesting that I move South Alabama and Middle Tennessee State to Power 5 conferences. And I actually do like that idea. I think it's going to be fun to put those programs against better opponents. I wanted to be semi-realistic with the custom conferences, but I also wanted to have fun with it and sort of shake up the series a little bit. So what I decided to do is I'm not convinced that these schools are ready to be Power 5 teams, but I do want to put them in a better conference. So South Alabama and Middle Tennessee State, at least for this year, will both be joining the American Athletic Conference. The American Athletic Conference saw some other big changes as well. I did some shuffling around. I added UConn to the conference, and I took a lot of schools out. UConn's a legitimately good program in this series, and this conference is kind of stacked. It might honestly be better than the Pac-12, if we're being completely honest. So I'm really excited to follow this conference next season with Middle Tennessee State, South Alabama, and a lot of other really good teams. Obviously, the Conference USA and the Sun Belt both take a hit by losing Middle Tennessee State and South Alabama, but both of them were able to add some new programs as well. Looking at some of the bigger conferences, the ACC added Maryland and Rutgers, stealing them from the Big Ten. But don't worry, Big Ten fans. I think you guys are the overall winner here. Notre Dame and Oregon are both now in the Big Ten Conference. So they will both be added to the Big Ten West. Purdue and Northwestern are going to slide over to the East. The Big Ten West might honestly be the better division now with adding UCLA, Oregon, USC, and Notre Dame in the last 2 years. And then Iowa, Minnesota, Nebraska, and Wisconsin are all respectable programs. Although Oregon is out of the Pac-12, they did pry away Boise State, Fresno State, and then another school, Air Force, from the Mountain West. So the Mountain West loses their 3 best teams, but they do add Idaho. The Big 12 steals Missouri and Vanderbilt from the SEC. I'm really excited to see what Vanderbilt can do next year. I think they're going to be a real sleeper, especially being in an easier conference. I think the Big 12 has done a really good job since losing Texas and Oklahoma to the SEC. Nobody new joins the SEC, but they do lose a couple schools, and then Arkansas is going to move to the SEC East, and then the MAC is the only conference that remains completely unchanged through this year's custom conferences schedule. I also am excited to announce that there will be a 12-team college football playoff. Just like in real life, we will have a 12-team playoff. I've been advocating for a 12-team playoff in real life for multiple years now. I think it's the perfect number. You reward the top 4 teams by giving them a bye, and you have more teams duking it out in the earlier rounds of the playoff. I think it's going to make the regular season especially interesting, especially in this series where there are less legitimately elite teams. So I think the regular season is going to be even more exciting here with a true playoff chase for the top 12 spots. I think we're going to have all of the Power 5 conference champions as well as the best Group 5 champion get in, and then 6 at-large bids. I don't want to give every Group 5 conference a team in the playoff because I don't think the games would be competitive, but I think having at least one Group 5 team will be good, and then if some of the other ones are good enough for an at-large bid, I think that'd be fair as well. So that's going to wrap up the offseason. Let me know what you thought of the players leaving stage, the coaching carousel, recruiting, custom conferences, and of course the 12-team college football playoff. The next episode, we will be previewing season number 2. We're going to go over some of these rosters. We're going to refamiliarize ourselves with some of the players who we know from season 1, and we're also going to introduce ourselves to some new players who we didn't get to meet in season number 1. Should be a lot of fun. Make sure to leave a like and subscribe to the channel if you are new. Peace out.